Dawn, October 25, 1944. Off the island of Samar, a young sailor on the deck of a thin-skinned escort carrier looks north and sees something that should not exist. The silhouettes of enemy battleships, the largest ever built, rising over the horizon. Between those battleships and 20,000 American soldiers on the beaches of Leyte stands almost nothing. 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, no battle line, no air cover worth the name. The ships meant to stop them are 200 miles away, chasing a trap. This should never have happened. 3 months earlier, in a quiet room in Hawaii, 2 of the most powerful men in the Pacific War sat across from each other and refused to agree. One wanted nearly the entire United States fleet placed under his command. The other said no. That single word, spoken calmly, without raised voices, without headlines, would decide whether the Pacific War ended in victory or in the worst naval disaster since Pearl Harbor. Somewhere between a general's promise and an admiral's refusal, thousands of men were about to pay the price for a decision made in a room they never saw. By the summer of 1944, General Douglas MacArthur had fought his way across 2,000 miles of Pacific Ocean, from the mosquito-choked jungles of New Guinea to the very doorstep of the Philippines. Behind him lay a trail of nameless islands, airstrips carved out of coral, and tens of thousands of graves marked with simple white crosses. 2 years earlier, he had left those islands under cover of darkness, ordered out by President Roosevelt as Japanese forces closed in on Corregidor. He had gone by PT boat through waters patrolled by enemy destroyers, leaving behind soldiers he knew would soon be starving on the Bataan Peninsula, or worse. He carried with him a promise, one he would repeat to the American press and to the Filipino people the moment he reached safety in Australia. "I shall return." Those 3 words had since been printed on matchbooks, stamped onto cigarette packets smuggled into Japanese prison camps, and whispered by Filipino guerrillas hiding in the hills. They were no longer just a soldier's pledge. They were a debt, and everyone from the White House to the rice paddies of Luzon expected it to be paid. Now, 64 years old, his hair gray beneath the gold-braided cap he wore like a second skin, weathered by 2 years of jungle campaigns, he intended to keep that promise, but he did not intend to keep it alone. MacArthur wanted the United States Pacific Fleet, nearly all of it, placed under his personal command to retake the Philippines. He wanted the carriers. He wanted the battleships. He wanted the amphibious forces. He wanted Admiral Chester Nimitz's entire Central Pacific war machine redirected to serve a single objective: his return. The Navy saw things differently. In Washington, Admiral Ernest King, 65 years old and Chief of Naval Operations, believed the Philippines should be bypassed entirely. His plan was colder, and in his eyes, far more effective. Seize Formosa instead. Cut Japan off from the oil, rubber, and raw materials flowing north from Southeast Asia. Starve the empire before a single American soldier set foot in Manila. To King, the Philippines were a sideshow, a costly and time-consuming detour driven less by strategy than by one man's need to make good on a headline. 59 years old, silver-haired, with the calm bearing of a man who had spent his career at sea rather than in front of newspapermen, Admiral Chester Nimitz commanded the Pacific Fleet from a modest office overlooking the still-scarred harbor at Pearl. He walked past the rusted hulks of the battleships sunk there in 1941 nearly every day, a reminder he did not need but never ignored. He shared much of King's reasoning. He had spent 2 years building the most powerful naval force the world had ever seen. Fast carriers steaming in formations that stretched to the horizon. Modern battleships bristling with radar-controlled guns. Veteran amphibious crews, hardened by Tarawa, by Kwajalein, by Saipan. Men who had learned through blood exactly how to storm a beach. He had no intention of handing that force, built one hard-fought island at a time, to an army general who had never commanded a fleet action in his life. Nimitz did not raise his voice. He rarely did. Those who served under him said he could deliver devastating news, in the same even tone he used to discuss the weather. He simply made his position known through the chain of command, quietly and without theater. The fleet stays under naval authority. But 1944 was not only a year of war, it was an election year, and Franklin Roosevelt, 62 years old, was seeking an unprecedented fourth term as president. MacArthur was not merely a general to him. He was a political weapon aimed in an uncertain direction. Conservative Republicans had courted him for months as a possible presidential candidate, and MacArthur had done nothing to shut the door. Roosevelt understood that MacArthur commanded loyalty far beyond his own soldiers, loyalty among voters who remembered a promise made to a suffering people. He could not overrule the general publicly. He could not, either, let a soldier dictate where his admirals sailed. So Roosevelt made an extraordinary decision. The President of the United States would travel in person to Hawaii, sit between his two most powerful Pacific commanders, and force a resolution himself. On July 26, 1944, Roosevelt arrived at Pearl Harbor aboard the cruiser USS Baltimore. Nimitz stood on the dock to greet him. MacArthur was not there, not yet. He had been ordered to attend, and by every account he resented it, privately calling the whole affair a picture-taking excursion for a man running for re-election. When MacArthur finally did arrive, he made an entrance built for cameras. A long open limousine rolled down the road from the airfield, engines of a full motorcycle escort growling ahead and behind it, and crowds of sailors and civilians gathered along the route just to catch a glimpse of him standing tall in the back seat, cap tilted, waving as though he were already a candidate for higher office. Flashbulbs popped along the roadside. It was theater, and it was deliberate, every gesture calculated for the newsreels that would play in movie houses from California to New York within the week. Whatever this meeting decided, MacArthur intended to remind the president and everyone watching exactly who the most famous soldier in America was. That evening, aboard the Baltimore, the three most powerful men shaping the war in the Pacific sat down together beneath the low hum of the cruiser's overhead fans, a large map of the Pacific pinned to a board nearby, its surface dotted with pins marking islands most Americans back home had never heard of. No transcript of that conversation survives. What is known is that the argument which followed, calm on the surface and unyielding underneath, would decide the fate of the largest fleet ever assembled, and the lives of nearly 200,000 men who had no idea their futures were being weighed over dinner in a ship's wardroom. MacArthur spoke first, and he spoke at length. His case blended military strategy with moral obligation, and beneath both, an unmistakable edge of political threat. The Philippines, he reminded them, were American territory. 17 million Filipinos lived under Japanese occupation. American prisoners of war, survivors of Bataan and Corregidor, were starving in Japanese camps at that very hour. The United States, he argued, carried a constitutional duty to free them. To bypass the islands now, after everything, would be to leave what he called blood on America's soul. What MacArthur left unspoken mattered just as much. He did not mention that a Philippine campaign meant months of brutal fighting across an archipelago of 7,000 islands. He did not mention that his plan required the Navy's Third Fleet to answer, in practice, to his own strategic direction. And he did not say the obvious truth sitting in the room with them, that this was in no small part personal. Nimitz answered quietly, without theater of his own. He laid out the case for Formosa in plain, unemotional terms. Seizing the island would place American forces closer to the Japanese home islands than Luzon ever could. It would sever Japan's supply lines more completely. It would open a direct route to resupply Chinese forces still fighting on the mainland. And it would not require the Navy to place its carriers, its battleships, and its sailors under the strategic direction of a general who had never fought a fleet action in his life. Nimitz never attacked MacArthur directly. That was not how he operated. Admiral William Leahy, Roosevelt's chief of staff and a quiet observer at the table, later wrote that it was both pleasant and informative to watch two men the newspapers had painted as bitter rivals calmly lay out such different views. But beneath that calm sat something absolute. Nimitz was telling both MacArthur and his president that the Pacific Fleet would not simply be handed over. Not the carriers, not the battleships, not the crews who had bled to build them into the force they had become. The disagreement went deeper than strategy. It reached into the very structure of how the war was being fought. Since 1942, the Pacific had been split into two commands that operated side by side, but never beneath one another. MacArthur held the Southwest Pacific area, his ground forces, his own 7th Fleet, his land-based air power. Nimitz held the Pacific Ocean areas, the main battle fleet, the fast carriers, the entire Central Pacific offensive. Neither man reported to the other, and MacArthur had chafed under that arrangement for 2 years, repeatedly demanding unified command under himself. King and Nimitz had refused him every time. To the Navy, the logic was simple and non-negotiable. Command of the fleet could not be separated from control of it. You could not hand an Army general strategic direction over carrier task forces and expect the officers who commanded them to execute his orders without naval oversight, standing behind every decision. The Pacific Fleet was not a ferry service built to carry soldiers to a beach. It was a weapon with its own doctrine, its own hard-won lessons, and its own chain of command, built in blood since the morning the battleships burned at Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt made no decision that night. He listened, his cigarette holder tilted at its familiar angle, his face giving away nothing to either man. He smiled for the cameras the next morning, touring the wounded at the Naval Hospital in his wheelchair, shaking hands with sailors still bandaged from the fighting at Saipan. He toured the docks where new ships waited to be provisioned, and then he boarded the Baltimore once more and sailed home to Washington, leaving both commanders standing on the pier at Pearl Harbor to wonder, in the humid morning air, which of them he had actually believed. Neither man would find out for another 2 weeks. And in that silence, the machinery of 2 navies, 2 armies, and 1 desperate enemy kept moving, unaware that the answer, whatever it turned out to be, would be tested not in a conference room, but in the waters of a gulf neither Roosevelt nor his commanders had yet named. For 2 long weeks after the Baltimore sailed out of Pearl Harbor and back toward the mainland, neither MacArthur nor Nimitz received a final answer. The decision moved instead through the machinery in Washington, where the Joint Chiefs of Staff weighed King's cold logic against MacArthur's moral argument, and might have kept weighing it for months longer still had events unfolding in the Pacific itself not intervened first. In September, Admiral William Halsey, 61 years old, blunt-spoken, and known throughout the fleet for a temperament as aggressive as his jaw was square, took his 3rd Fleet carriers on a series of raids against Japanese positions across the central and southern Philippines. Pilots launched at dawn from flight decks pitching in the swell, climbing into skies they expected to fill with enemy fighters, ready for the kind of brutal air battles that had cost so many young men their lives over Rabaul and the Marianas. Instead, his pilots found weakness. Airfields lightly defended, rows of Japanese aircraft caught still parked on the ground and destroyed by the hundreds before they ever left the runway. Shipping sunk with almost no opposition in the air, merchant vessels and small escorts burning in the harbors long before their crews could get them underway. Squadron after squadron returned to their carriers that week with the same report, delivered with a mixture of relief and disbelief in the ready rooms. Almost nothing came up to meet them. Halsey drew the only conclusion a man of his instincts could draw. The Philippines were softer than anyone in Washington believed, and the central island of Leyte, rather than the more heavily fortified Mindanao originally scheduled first, was ripe for a direct strike. Halsey sent his recommendation up the chain within hours, a message that would set in motion supply schedules, troop movements, and shipping timetables across half the Pacific. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, meeting in Washington even as the report arrived, made one of the fastest major strategic reversals of the entire war. Within a matter of days, they scrapped months of careful planning, canceled the invasion of Mindanao entirely, and approved a direct assault on Leyte, moving the target date 2 full months earlier than anyone in the supply and logistics commands had prepared for. Ships already loaded for one operation had to be redirected. Divisions training for one timetable had to accelerate their schedules by weeks. It was not, in the end, a president's letter or a quiet word at a Hawaiian dinner table that decided the Philippines campaign, whatever MacArthur privately believed about where the credit belonged. It was a fleet commander's carrier raid, a stack of reconnaissance photographs showing burned-out airfields, and a room full of officers in Washington willing to act on them overnight, rather than wait for the caution of the original plan. But acting fast did not mean the command dispute was resolved. It only meant it was papered over. The fleet would support MacArthur's return to the Philippines. On that much, everyone agreed. What remained unresolved was who would answer to whom. The compromise that emerged satisfied no one completely, and in its structure lay a fault line that would nearly bring the entire operation to catastrophe. Two fleets, built from different traditions and answering to different masters, would sail for Leyte together, side by side yet never truly joined. Halsey's Third Fleet, built around the fast carriers, the fleet's speed and striking power, would remain under Nimitz's authority, reporting to Pearl Harbor. Its mission, broadly defined, was to protect the invasion and, if the opportunity arose, to destroy the Japanese fleet wherever it could be found. Rear Admiral Thomas Kinkaid's Seventh Fleet, the old battleships, the escort carriers, the transports carrying the invasion force itself, would report to MacArthur. Its mission was narrower and more immediate: protect the landing beaches directly, at all costs. Two fleets, two admirals, two chains of command running to two different headquarters thousands of miles apart. Halsey answered to Nimitz. Kinkaid answered to MacArthur. There was no single officer at sea empowered to give an order to both fleets at once, and no direct, dedicated radio channel built to let the two admirals coordinate their movements in real time. Messages between them had to travel up one chain of command and down the other, relayed through headquarters far from the battle itself, a process that could take hours when minutes mattered most. Staff officers on both sides understood the danger in the abstract. War games and planning documents in the months before the invasion had noted, almost in passing, that a gap existed between the two fleets' areas of responsibility, a seam in the line where responsibility for the waters northeast of Leyte Gulf was never assigned with total clarity to either commander. Nobody resolved it. Nobody wanted to be the one to raise, yet again, the old argument about unified command that had already strained relations between two headquarters that barely spoke to each other as it was. It was easier, in the rush of preparing the largest amphibious operation the Pacific had yet seen, to assume that the danger was theoretical, that no Japanese force still capable of offensive action would ever find that seam, let alone thread a battle fleet through it in the dark. It was a structure born of the very rivalry that had produced it, a compromise designed to let both the Army and the Navy claim victory without either surrendering control, and it would carry a hidden cost that neither Nimitz nor MacArthur fully reckoned with as their staffs finalized the plans in the weeks that followed the meeting aboard the Baltimore. Both men had gotten what they most wanted. MacArthur would have his fleet supporting his return. Nimitz would keep the Navy's carriers and battleships under naval command, free from an Army general's direct orders. What neither man had built was a way for their two admirals, once battle was joined, to see the same picture of the fight unfolding around them. On October 20th, 1944, the cost of that arrangement was still invisible, hidden beneath the roar of the largest invasion fleet yet assembled in the Pacific. 130,000 soldiers of General Walter Kruger's Sixth Army began pouring onto the beaches of Leyte under a sky thick with smoke from naval gunfire. Landing craft by the hundreds ground onto the sand, ramps dropping, men wading through knee-deep surf still warm from the tropical sun. MacArthur came ashore that afternoon, wading through the water with his officers behind him, his khaki uniform soaked to the waist, his sunglasses catching the gray light of a sky still hazy with cordite smoke, his corncob pipe clenched between his teeth. Around him, the beach was a scene of ordered chaos. Bulldozers clearing wreckage, medics carrying stretchers from the surf, soldiers digging in beneath the tree line, while landing craft continued to grind ashore behind them. He walked up to a portable radio microphone set up near the beach and spoke to the Filipino people directly, his voice carrying a weight 2 years in the making, static crackling as the signal went out across the islands. "People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil. Soil consecrated in the blood of our two peoples. It was the fulfillment of the promise made on a dark night in 1942, broadcast now to a nation still occupied, still starving in places, but no longer waiting." Behind that single moment stood 2 fleets, representing a concentration of naval power without precedent in human history. Halsey's Third Fleet alone carried 8 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, 6 fast battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers screening them, a force capable of launching more aircraft in a single strike than most nations possessed in their entire air forces. Kinkaid's 7th Fleet added 6 older battleships, several of them survivors raised and repaired after Pearl Harbor, 18 escort carriers providing close air support for the beaches, and a dense screen of destroyers and destroyer escorts. Together, the 2 fleets numbered more than 200 warships. It was, by any measure, the most powerful naval force ever gathered in one place, and it was split by design into 2 halves that could not speak to each other directly. In Tokyo, Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commander of what remained of Japan's combined fleet, understood immediately what the American invasion meant. If Leyte fell, the Philippines would fall, and if the Philippines fell, Japan's supply lines to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the fuel that kept every ship in his fleet moving at all, would be severed for good. The war, for all practical purposes, would already be lost, whatever fighting remained afterward. Toyota had few ships left compared to the force massing in Leyte Gulf, barely a third of the tonnage the Americans could bring to bear, and almost no trained pilots left to fly from his remaining carriers. After 2 years of losses, the training schools in Japan had never been able to replace. What he did have was intelligence, patient and detailed, and a plan built entirely around the one weakness his officers had identified in the American command structure during months of watching radio traffic and studying the organization of the enemy fleet. The 2 fleets guarding the invasion did not answer to the same headquarters, and if one of them, the fast and aggressive one, could be lured away even briefly by exactly the kind of target its doctrine could not resist, the gap between the 2 fleets could be turned into a highway straight to the invasion beaches. The plan was called Shogo, Victory, and it called for 3 separate Japanese naval forces to converge on Leyte Gulf from different directions at nearly the same moment, a piece of naval choreography so complex that it depended on nearly everything going right, and on the Americans making exactly the mistake their divided command structure had made possible. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita would lead the center force through the San Bernardino Strait from the west, built around the 2 largest battleships ever constructed, the Yamato and the Musashi, floating fortresses displacing more than 60,000 tons apiece, each mounting 18-inch guns capable of firing a shell the weight of a small automobile more than 20 miles. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura would lead a smaller southern force through the Surigao Strait, aiming to strike the landing beaches from the south, while Kurita struck from the north, a pincer intended to crush the invasion between 2 hammers at once. And Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would sail a northern force of 4 aircraft carriers, stripped of nearly all their aircraft and experienced pilots after months of attrition the Japanese Navy had never been able to replace, south from Japan with a single purpose: be seen, be chased. Pull Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from the strait it was meant to guard. It was, in effect, a plan built on sacrifice. Ozawa knew his carriers, nearly empty of the aircraft that gave a carrier its purpose, stood almost no chance of surviving the encounter he intended to provoke. He was not sailing to win a battle. He was sailing to be bait, offering his ships and the lives of his crews as the price of drawing America's most aggressive admiral out of position long enough for Kurita's battleships to reach the beaches unopposed. He gave the order anyway, understanding exactly what it would likely cost, because the alternative, doing nothing while the Philippines fell, guaranteed an even greater loss. The battle began on October 23rd, in the darkness before dawn, when the American submarines Darter and Dace, patrolling the Palawan Passage on routine watch, picked up the unmistakable shapes of a large Japanese task force on radar and moved to intercept. What they found exceeded anything either submarine captain had expected to encounter that week. An entire battle fleet steaming in formation, cruisers and battleships stacked in columns stretching toward the horizon. The two submarines attacked before the Japanese ships even reached open water suitable for a fleet engagement, firing spreads of torpedoes into the darkness and diving before the escorts could respond. Two heavy cruisers were sunk within minutes of each other, their hulls torn open below the waterline, and Kurita himself was thrown into the sea when his flagship, the cruiser Atago, went down beneath him in a matter of minutes, forcing the admiral to swim for his life among burning oil slicks before being pulled from the water hours later and transferred, shaken but alive, to the battleship Yamato. It was an inauspicious start to a plan that depended entirely on stealth and timing, and the Americans now knew, with absolute certainty, that a major Japanese force was moving toward Leyte, though how many ships, and toward which strait, remained for the next 2 days a matter of urgent and often contradictory reconnaissance. The next day, October 24th, American carrier aircraft found Kurita's fleet in the Sibuyan Sea and attacked in waves throughout the day, squadron after squadron diving out of the clouds through curtains of anti-aircraft fire, thrown up by every gun the Japanese ships could bring to bear. The Musashi absorbed hit after hit, torpedoes and bombs tearing into her hull for hours as she slowed, listed, and continued to slow further still, her crew fighting to keep her afloat compartment by flooding compartment. By late afternoon she could barely make way, trailing oil and smoke for miles behind her, until the great ship finally rolled over and sank beneath the waves that evening, taking more than 1,000 of her crew down with her into the deep water of the Sibuyan Sea. It was a staggering loss, the destruction of one of the two most powerful battleships ever built by any navy in history, and for a time it appeared the American pilots had broken the back of Kurita's force entirely. Kurita himself, battered and having lost his flagship once already in this campaign, turned his remaining ships around under the weight of the air assault, and appeared, by every report reaching Halsey that evening, to be retreating west, away from the strait, away from the invasion, beaten into withdrawal. That same night, far to the south, Nishimura's southern force entered the Surigao Strait in the darkness before dawn on October 25th, sailing directly into a trap of its own. Admiral Kinkaid had arranged Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's old battleships, several of them survivors raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor itself, and rebuilt for exactly this kind of night, in a line across the northern end of the strait, executing what naval officers had studied in textbooks for decades but almost never achieved in practice against a real enemy, a perfect crossing of the enemy's T. PT boats and destroyers harried Nishimura's column first, torpedoes streaking through the dark water, and then the battleships opened fire, their radar-directed guns finding targets the Japanese lookouts could barely see through the night. Nishimura's ships steamed into a wall of concentrated gunfire, unable to bring their own broadsides to bear, illuminated one after another by the flash of their own destruction. Within hours, the southern force was annihilated. Nishimura went down with his flagship, one of the last admirals in naval history to die, commanding a battle line in a fight of that kind. It was as complete and one-sided a naval victory as the war had produced, and it convinced Kinkaid, understandably, that the southern approach to Leyte Gulf was secure, freeing his attention for the transports and the beachhead rather than the waters to the north. But the true danger was not coming from the south. It was coming from the north, through the strait everyone believed Kurita had already abandoned. Late on the night of October 24th, as his pilots reported Kurita's force retreating and burning, Halsey received a second piece of intelligence, that would shape the most consequential decision of his career. Scout planes had located Ozawa's northern force, 4 aircraft carriers sailing south toward the Philippines. To Halsey, a man who had spent 2 years hunting the Japanese carrier fleet that had struck Pearl Harbor without ever landing the decisive blow that would finish it, the report looked like an opportunity that might never come again. Somewhere in the back of his mind sat the doctrine drilled into every American carrier admiral since the disaster of the Java Sea, the doctrine that had won Midway. Find the enemy's carriers, destroy them. Everything else is secondary. He had watched other commanders let the Japanese carrier fleet slip away before. He did not intend to be the admiral who let it happen again. Aboard his flagship, the battleship New Jersey, Halsey weighed the reports crossing his desk that evening. Kurita's force, by every account from his own pilots, had been smashed and was withdrawing. Ozawa's carriers, fresh and undamaged as far as anyone could tell from the air, represented the last significant Japanese carrier force left afloat in the entire Pacific. What Halsey did not know, could not know, given the wreckage of Ozawa's air groups and the deliberate thinness of the reports reaching him, was that the carriers he was looking at carried almost no aircraft left to defend themselves, let alone strike anyone. They were a shell of a fleet, hollowed out by months of losses the Japanese Navy had never been able to replace, sent south for the sole purpose of being found. Toyota had built his entire plan around a gamble on exactly this instinct, betting that no American admiral, and certainly not Halsey, could resist the chance to destroy an enemy carrier fleet once it was located. Halsey took the bait completely. Shortly after midnight on October 25th, he turned his entire Third Fleet, every fast battleship, every fleet carrier, every escorting cruiser and destroyer, north in pursuit of Ozawa's decoy force, determined to finish off the Japanese carrier fleet once and for all. He did not detach a portion of his battleships to guard the strait behind him, a choice he would spend years afterward defending and explaining. In his mind, dividing his own force risked losing the very carriers he was chasing, and Kurita's fleet, according to every report on his desk, was no longer a threat worth guarding against. In doing so, he left the San Bernardino Strait, the very passage Kurita's battleships had been aiming for from the start, completely undefended. Not a single American warship, not a destroyer, not a picket boat, remained behind to watch it. And because Halsey's Third Fleet answered to Nimitz in Pearl Harbor, not to Kincaid at Leyte, no one aboard the Seventh Fleet's ships, the old battleships now low on ammunition after the fight at Surigao Strait, the escort carriers with their thin hulls and their planes loaded for supporting troops ashore, rather than fighting battleships, received any word that the strait guarding their northern flank had been left open. MacArthur's invasion force, the men on the beaches at Leyte, the transports still unloading supplies, the wounded still being carried from the surf, all of it sat exposed, and no one commanding the ships that could have warned them even knew there was a warning to give. Because Kurita had not retreated at all. His withdrawal on the afternoon of the 24th had been real, a genuine reaction to the pounding his ships had taken in the Sibuyan Sea, but it had also been temporary. Once the American strike aircraft turned back to their carriers and the skies over his fleet finally cleared, Kurita reversed course a second time. Under cover of darkness, his battered center force, still built around the giant battleship Yamato, 4 other battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers, turned back east and threaded through the San Bernardino Strait in the black hours before dawn, running without lights, engines answering full ahead, sailing directly toward the one stretch of ocean that history, and the 6,000 American sailors who would find themselves fighting there within hours, would come to know simply as Samar. Not one lookout on any American ship saw them pass quietly in the darkness that night. Not one radio message went out to warn the men waiting, unaware, on the other side of the strait. At dawn on October 25, 1944, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague stood on the bridge of the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay, coffee still in hand, and watched the horizon to the north fill with shapes that should not have been there. Pagoda masts rising against the gray morning light. massive gray hulls throwing up white water as they came on at speed. The unmistakable silhouette of battleships bearing down on his tiny formation, a group of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts that sailors throughout the fleet called, almost affectionately, Taffy 3. Anti-aircraft shells began falling among his ships moments later, colored dye marking the splashes so each Japanese gunnery officer could distinguish his own fire from the others. Pink and green and yellow columns of water rising all around the little American formation, like some grotesque carnival. These were not warships built to fight battleships. The escort carriers were converted merchant hulls, thin-skinned, slow, armed with a single 5-inch gun each that could barely dent a destroyer, let alone a dreadnought. The destroyers carried torpedoes, and little else heavier. Standing between them and Kurita's center force, 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers carrying more combined firepower than most nations possessed, was nothing. No battle line. No Halsey, somewhere over the horizon chasing an empty promise. Just the sea, and whatever these men chose to do next. Sprague did the only thing left to do. He turned his carriers to launch every aircraft they carried, ordered his destroyers to make smoke, and sent the message that would summon help from every direction at once. Then he watched as his 3 destroyers, Johnston, Howell, and Herman, turned not away from the battleships, but directly toward them. What followed has been called, without exaggeration, one of the most extraordinary actions in the history of naval warfare. The destroyer Johnston, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans, a Cherokee officer who had told his crew on the day he took command that he intended to fight the ship rather than run her, charged alone at the Japanese cruisers first, closing to point-blank range through a forest of shell splashes and firing torpedoes that struck and crippled the heavy cruiser Kumano. Riddled with shell fire from ships many times her size, her bridge destroyed, half her crew dead or wounded, steering by hand from the fantail after her rudder controls were shot away. Evans himself eventually killed. Johnston kept fighting until she had nothing left to fight with, and finally rolled over and sank beneath men still firing what guns remained working. Howell and the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts followed the same path, closing with battleships and cruisers that could have destroyed them from 10 miles away, firing 5-inch guns against 18-inch armor, because it was the only weapon they had, and there was no order to do anything else. Both ships absorbed hit after hit, until there was nothing left of them to fight with, and both went down with much of their crews still at their stations. The escort carriers launched everything that could fly, and when the bombs and torpedoes ran out, pilots continued making dry runs, diving at the Japanese ships with empty racks, simply to force them to maneuver and break formation. The ferocity and chaos of the attack, destroyers weaving through shell splashes at flank speed, aircraft diving from every direction, smoke thick enough to blind Japanese rangefinders, created a confusion Kurita's own lookouts could not resolve. Japanese observers, seeing the sheer scale of the resistance thrown against them, misjudged the size of the American force entirely, reporting cruisers and fleet carriers where only escort carriers and destroyers actually sailed. The cost was severe. The destroyers Johnston and Howell were sunk. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts went down fighting battleships 80 times her displacement. The escort carrier Gambier Bay, hit repeatedly by naval gunfire at close range, became the only American aircraft carrier lost to surface gunfire in the entire war. Within the hour, the escort carrier St. Lo would be struck and destroyed by a deliberate suicide attack, one of the first major warships lost to the tactic the Japanese called kamikaze, a weapon born from desperation that would define the war's final and bloodiest year. And then, with the beachhead at Leyte still exposed, with nothing left between his battleships and the transports beyond a handful of burning American ships and the smoke of a battle that had already lasted more than 2 hours, Vice Admiral Kurita made a decision that has puzzled historians for 80 years. Believing, based on the sheer ferocity of Taffy III's resistance, that he had run into a much larger portion of the American fleet than he actually faced, perhaps even the fast carriers of the Third Fleet itself, and worried about his own scattered formation, his dwindling fuel, and his depleted ammunition after 2 days of continuous air attack, Kurita ordered his fleet to break off, reform, and withdraw back through the San Bernardino Strait the way it had come. The invasion beaches, the transports still unloading supplies, the wounded still lying ashore at Leyte, all of it sat within his reach, undefended and only a few hours steaming away. He chose not to take it, and turned north, and then west instead, back toward open water, and eventually home. Far to the north and east, at his headquarters overlooking Pearl Harbor, Nimitz had been following the fragmentary reports from Samar with growing alarm, plotting the widening gap between Halsey's pursuit of Ozawa and the exposed transports at Leyte on a chart that told a story he did not like. Halsey's fleet was still hours away from the fighting, chasing Ozawa's decoy carriers ever further north, and the message Nimitz sent that morning would become one of the most famous and most misunderstood signals of the entire war. "Where is Task Force 34?" it read, a straightforward question about the whereabouts of Halsey's battleship force, the ships that could have turned back to guard the strait at any point in the previous 12 hours. But naval communication procedure of the era required padding phrases at the beginning and end of a message to confuse enemy codebreakers listening in, and the padding attached to the end of this one, "The World Wonders," was never meant to be read as part of the message at all, only stripped away by the receiving officer before it reached the admiral's desk. When it arrived on Halsey's flagship, an overzealous communications officer failed to remove the padding, and the message read instead as a pointed, humiliating, and very public rebuke from his own commander-in-chief. Halsey, by his own later account, was staggered, reportedly hurling his cap to the deck of his bridge in fury and grief, and only then finally turned a portion of his fleet back south, though by the time his battleships arrived at full speed, Kurita's ships were already withdrawing through the strait they had come through hours before, and there was nothing left for Halsey's guns to find. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought across more than 100,000 square miles of ocean over 3 days, ended the Imperial Japanese Navy as an effective fighting force. Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, and more than 10,000 sailors. The fleet that had dominated the Pacific since 1941 would never again sail to contest American control of the sea in force. Only the doomed final voyage of the Yamato, sent on a one-way mission to Okinawa 7 months later, remained. American losses, though far lighter, revealed exactly how thin the margin of survival had been. Had Kurita pressed his attack at Samar for even another hour, historians generally agree, the 7th Fleet's transports and MacArthur's entire invasion force would have been exposed to the most powerful concentration of naval gunfire left in the Pacific, a disaster that no strategic objective could have justified and no divided command structure could have prevented once it began. In December 1944, Nimitz was promoted to Fleet Admiral, one of only 4 men ever to hold the 5-star rank in the United States Navy, recognition for a campaign that had broken the back of Japan's naval power without ever requiring him to surrender control of the fleet he had spent 2 years building. He never spoke publicly about how close that fleet had come to catastrophe at Samar, and those who worked closest to him said he never needed to. MacArthur, promoted to General of the Army that same month, continued his campaign across the Philippine archipelago, a grinding fight that would not end until the war itself did, costing more than 10,000 additional American lives and over 36,000 wounded, casualties that some historians argue could have been reduced had the campaign bypassed islands no longer of strategic value, rather than clearing every garrison in turn. On September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri anchored in Tokyo Bay, Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz signed the instrument of Japanese surrender on behalf of the United States Navy. General of the Army Douglas MacArthur presided over the entire ceremony as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, his voice carrying across the deck to a world finally at peace. The two men stood only a few feet apart that morning. The general who had once demanded almost the entire Pacific Fleet for his own command, and the admiral who had quietly refused to give it to him. Neither man ever publicly relitigated the argument that had nearly cost them everything off the coast of Samar. 282 ships fought at Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in recorded history. The fleet that Nimitz had insisted on keeping under naval command destroyed 4 Japanese carriers, 3 battleships, and dozens of escorts in a single, decisive engagement. The same divided command structure that had made that victory possible had also nearly handed Japan its greatest naval triumph of the war, saved only by 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts that had no business surviving the morning, buying time with their own hulls that a compromise reached over dinner in Hawaii should never have required them to buy.